In the week between the two Iberian races, the Space Shuttle Discovery took off on mission STS-26, the first flight for the shuttle since the Challenger disaster in 1986. 3 of the 5-man crew had been slated to take the next mission back in 1986, and this one would place into orbit a satellite to replace the one lost in the explosion. Pilot Richard Covey, meanwhile, had been flight controller, Capcom in NASA lingo, in Houston on that fateful day, and his voice saying,
"Challenger, go at throttle up,"
just before the explosion had been heard on news broadcasts around the world. In the North Sea, there was another fire on an oil rig as the Ocean Odyssey, which was drilling a new field, caught fire. Fortunately, the fire wasn't as serious as the one that had caused Piper Alpha to explode earlier in the year, but it still cost one life, that of radio operator Timothy Williams, after the rig manager forgot to tell him to evacuate. The rig itself was salvaged and towed to Dundee, where it sat rusting for years until being refitted and put back into service as an offshore space rocket launch pad, a job it kept until 2014. And the Solar Olympics came to a close on the day of the Spanish Grand Prix. The Games had proved broadly successful, but there had been a few major controversies. Most notably, Canadian sprinter Ben Johnson had been stripped of his gold medal in the prestigious men's 100-metre sprint after testing positive for anabolic steroids, the victory instead being awarded to Carl Lewis, who thus became the first man to win the event twice. 2 Bulgarian weightlifters were also stripped of gold medals, and a Hungarian of silver, also for doping. In the boxing ring, meanwhile, American boxer Roy Jones Jr. dominated the light middleweight category, not dropping a single round en route to the final, where he danced rings round local hero Park Si-hun, landing 86 punches to Park's 32, only for the Korean to be awarded the gold on a judge's decision. Outside of the controversies, though, there were plenty of feel-good stories. Swedish fencer Kirsten Palm became the first woman to compete in 7 Olympics. Suriname's Anthony Nesty took a shot gold medal, his nation's first medal of any colour, in the men's 100-metre butterfly. Another nation winning its first ever medal was Indonesia, with silver in the women's team archery. Canadian sailor Laurence Lemieux gave up an almost certain silver medal to stop and help a competitor who'd been injured after capsizing, and was awarded the Pierre de Coubertin medal for sportsmanship. And East German cyclist Christa Luding-Rothenberger got a silver medal to add to her 2 speed skating medals from Calgary, and the first athlete to win medals in 2 different games in the same year. And if anyone else wanted to try that, they only had one more chance. When the dust had settled, the Soviet Union was handily top of the medals table, with a record tally that stands to this day of 55 golds among 132 total medals. Around the world, the F1 transporters drove the 450 miles, 725 kilometres, across southern Spain in baking heat and set up at Jerez. Pundits and fans alike had their calculators out, because Prost's win in Portugal was his 11th points finish of the year, and from now on he would have to start discarding results thanks to a somewhat arcane rule in the scoring system. Senna, for his part, had scored 10 times, so he could have 1 more points finish before he had to start discarding any. Moreover, Prost had been first or second every time he scored, so as things stood, if he won in Spain he'd have to discard a second place, and therefore only score a net 3 points, whereas Senna, finishing second, would get the full 6. If this sounds complicated and unfair, you're not alone. The FIA couldn't really move the goalposts now, but there was pressure to change things for 1989. Benetton, meanwhile, had announced that they would be taking up Johnny Herbert's option with them for 1989, with the young Brit's prognosis looking much better after his horrific accident at Brands a few weeks earlier. Which meant that McLaren, Williams, Ferrari and Benetton all had their lineups announced for next year, and none of them involved Ferrari refugee Michele Alboreto, who must be despairing of getting a drive at all. About the only team that could be considered a top drive, with the seat still unconfirmed, was Lotus, who had yet to announce Piquet's number 2, but Alboreto was a Marlboro man, and he would have to hope that the rumours of the Norfolk team losing their Camel sponsorship proved true. The other rumoured option for Alboreto might be a reconstructed Brabham team, who were said to be entering in 1989 after Bernie Ecclestone had finally found a buyer. Who the buyer was and what their plans might be nobody knew, but that didn't stop people attaching Alboreto's name, along with Dallara designer Sergio Rinland and Alfa Romeo power. Another rumour placed Nakajima in the Arrows team next year, with the British team allegedly taking on Japanese engines made by Honda's subsidiary Mugen. And the BBC's Murray Walker had a chat to some of the March team after their fantastic showing in Portugal, including their young designer Adrian Newey.
March Judd is your first Grand Prix car, and a tremendously successful one. When you had the clean sheet of paper in front of you to design it, what were you trying to do?
Well, basically, when you design the car, you have three parameters you have to fit in. You have to fit in the driver, obviously, the engine, which is the Judd engine, and fuel tank capacity of around 185 litres for this. So the first thing is to consider how small the sizes of these, and then make the car as small as we could around those three parameters, and optimise the aerodynamics around those three.
Now, the drivers, I understand, feel that it's rather on the too small side. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, the drivers think we've overdone it. And I guess we'll probably have to concede a bit for next year, because they have trouble at the end of the race with cramp in their legs and so on. As you can see, the tub's quite narrow and the cockpit's very small, but the problem is that the legs are probably a bit too short, so we'll stretch that out for next year.
The tight, twisty, dusty Jerez circuit would suit the atmospheric cars much better than the turbos, though of course even with Capelli's heroics in Estoril, nobody really expected anything other than another McLaren win. But a good showing at Estoril had seemingly put new confidence in the Williams team, and both drivers were looking good in practice. Unfortunately, Riccardo Patrese blotted his copybook when on a hot lap he was accidentally balked by Julian Bailey and had to throw out the anchors to avoid hitting the Tyrrell. The red mist apparently came down, he got himself in front of Bailey and brake-checked him hard. The resulting contact sent Julian into the gravel trap and brought both drivers, plus a completely blameless Jonathan Palmer, before the stewards, who tore the Tyrrell pairing off a strip for being too slow and generally a menace. An outraged protest by Ken Tyrrell got them to look at the footage again, and they agreed that, in fact, Patrese was at fault, and he was fined $10,000 plus the cost of fixing Bailey's car. Most in the paddock agreed that he'd got off pretty lightly with that. Elsewhere, the Arrows cars really struggled with a circuit entirely unsuited for their engines, and Gabriele Tarquini failed to pre-qualify after a raft of technical problems. Friday's session saw Senna top, with Mansell and Capelli close behind, while Boutsen's times were disallowed because his front wing end plates were 5mm too long, but on Saturday, Prost snuck into second to make it another McLaren lockout, with Mansell third by just 0.2 seconds off pole, and Boutsen and Nannini fourth and fifth, and also within a second of Senna. Capelli slipped to 6th alongside Patrese, with Berger's Ferrari 8th and the top non-McLaren turbo, Piquet and Alboreto making up the top 10, with Gugelmin just outside. Streff kept up AGS's good qualifying record alongside a good showing by Larini in the Azella. Nakajima was 15th, and the Ligiers, a good for 1988, 19th and 21st. One driver wryly observing that at Jerez, where everyone was having handling problems, theirs weren't such a handicap. Palmer was 22nd, local hero Sala could only manage 24th, but was still ahead of a deeply unhappy Eddie Cheever, with Modena scraping onto the grid. His teammate Larrauri would thus fail to qualify for the 7th time in 8 races, alongside both Zach Speeds and the unlucky Julian Bailey. Senna could put one hand on the trophy today with a win, but the momentum seemed to be with Prost after his effortless win in Portugal, and although reports coming out of McLaren suggested that Ron Dennis had got his two drivers in a room and cleared the air over the incident in Portugal, all eyes would be on the two McLaren cars as the grid lined up for the start. When the lights went green, Senna made an uncharacteristically slow getaway, and Prost leaped into the lead, with Mansell crowding the Brazilian down into third to boot as they all streamed round turn 1, with Capelli now up to 4th. Prost could hardly have asked for a better start and began to disappear in a cloud of Spanish dust as Senna tried to get past Mansell, with Patrese now having made it past both Benettons and Capelli to slot in behind the number 12 McLaren as well. Further back in the pack, Johansson and Palmer had made contact, but it was Arnoux who dropped out first, his throttle stuck shut. Cheever, meanwhile, had gone off avoiding the Johansson-Palmer shunt and was angrily pushed back on again. At the end of lap 1, Senna lunged in front of Mansell, but overcooked it and Mansell went back through, but Prost had already slowed up to conserve tyres and fuel, and Nigel and Ayrton were keeping in touch with him. Behind them, Patrese and Capelli were renewing their acquaintances once more, with Nannini close behind and the Ferraris following. In fact, Mansell was starting to leave Senna behind as they finished lap 3 and was chasing Prost down, while behind them, Senna was being caught by Patrese and co. A fine five-way scrap had developed, with Capelli still trying to get past Patrese as the Williams driver looked for a way past Senna, with Nannini and Berger close behind and ready to pounce on any mistakes. Larini's race was run with a front suspension failure after just 9 laps, by which time Palmer had also had to retire with damage from his collision in the opening lap, and Cheever went off again, but once more managed to keep it running and got back on the black bit to continue. By that time, Prost and Mansell were leading Senna by over 10 seconds, as Murray Walker on the BBC commentary committed one of his classic Murrayisms.
acknowledge that on the 12th lap, with a lead of just over a second, and knowing exactly where Nigel Mansell is, because he can see him in his earphone, see him in his mirror.
And pundits were wondering what might be up with Senna. In fact, just as in Portugal, his fuel readout was incorrectly reporting his usage and leading him to go slower than he could have been. Nakajima spun out from 11th on lap 15, to the great relief of the queue of cars that had built up behind him. Meanwhile, Prost caught his old teammate Cheever still struggling at the back after his excursions off track. Alboreto parked up with his traditional engine failure after 15 laps, at about the same time as Martini's Minardi gearbox packed up, and a lap before Streff's engine also let go, and all the time the 5-car Senna train jockeyed and jostled without ever changing positions, and the Spanish director found a bit of time to show Sala circulating on his own near the back, just as Mansell put up another fastest lap as he closed up on Prost. By now it was about a third distance, and Mansell was in Prost's wheel tracks, the pair now some 20 seconds ahead of Senna and co. at the end of lap 25. Nannini pitted a couple of laps later for new tyres, followed by Berger on lap 30 and Piquet on lap 32, and Sandro in the Benetton put up the fastest lap of the race so far on his first flying lap out, which would be food for thought for the other teams. By half distance, nothing much had changed though. Prost and Mansell led Senna by nearly 30 seconds, with the Brazilian leading Patrese and Capelli, and all 5 lapping within about 2/10 of each other, with Gugelmin now 6th, and Nannini and Berger charging back up from 7th and 8th after their stops. No sooner had the cameras cut away, Capelli got past Patrese into 4th as the Williams stuttered, and by the end of the lap the two Italians were a second and a half apart. Mansell also seemed to be having some trouble and dropped back off Prost dramatically. Capelli, meanwhile, was back behind Senna just as in Portugal. He'd said after the race at Estoril that he'd felt intimidated at the idea of trying to pass Ayrton Senna, and it took a while to work himself up to it, but here he had no such problems, taking 3rd place on lap 39. Whatever was up with Patrese's car seemed to sort itself out, and he rallied and began to attack Senna once more as Capelli set about doing something about that 32-second gap to Mansell. Warwick toured in to retire on lap 42 after going off on worn tyres and smashing up his undertray on the curbs, as Mansell seemed to rally as well and start chipping back away at Prost's lead, which had extended to about 5 seconds. Capelli, alas, was not to reprise his Portuguese heroics when his engine gave out. He had been driving with almost no clutch from very early on, it transpired. Just then, on lap 46, Mansell pitted for tyres to see if he could make any headway against Prost. Behind him, Senna still had Patrese right on his tail, until suddenly it was Nannini, which caught the director a bit by surprise. Nannini was flying on fresher tyres, unlike Senna, and took the place at the end of lap 48, just as Mansell set another fastest lap as he shot round the course in pursuit of Prost, who reacted by making a tyre stop of his own. Quick work put Alain back out in the lead to the tune of 19 seconds, with just over a third of the race still to go. Senna made his own stop on lap 50 of the 72, rejoining 7th behind Gugelmin and Berger. So with 22 laps to go, it was Prost leading Mansell by 18 seconds, then Nannini third, 10 seconds behind Mansell, Patrese, Gugelmin and Senna also in the top 6. Prost was now flying himself, lapping over a second quicker than Mansell, and heading inexorably towards his 34th career win, while Berger had got ahead of Gugelmin into 5th, and Mauricio soon dropped behind his countryman and former roommate Senna too. Mansell wasn't giving up, putting up another fastest lap on lap 57 as Senna nudged his boost up to get back past Berger into 5th. If Senna could catch Patrese 10 seconds ahead and take 4th, the 3 points would put him 1 win away from the title. As the laps ticked down to the end, Prost put up another fastest lap on lap 60, and Mansell seemed to back off and accept second place at that point, while it was Senna's turn to set fastest lap as he chased down Patrese. Soon enough, Senna was tucked up behind Ricciardo and pulled past on the start-finish straight, as Cheever finally gave up the unequal struggle, pulling in to retire from last place. Prost took the win, with Mansell taking just his second finish of the year, in second place just as he had been in Britain. Sandro Nannini, next year's Benetton team leader, was third, with Senna, Patrese and Berger taking the remaining points, the first time all year that Williams had scored both cars. Gugelmin came in a slightly disappointed 7th, March's first failure to score since France, with Piquet a solid 8th, encouraging for Lotus but not exactly where they were hoping to be at this point in the season. Boutsen was 9th after an early stop, Caffey a very creditable 10th after having been laid out most of the weekend with a nasty tummy bug, with Dalmas, Sala, Modena and Alio the rest of the runners. With Prost's win only worth 3 points, and Senna having a 6th place and a 4th place to drop in the last 2 races, the maths said that if Ayrton won in Japan, he would be world champion, whatever Prost did. It was time for the F1 circus to say goodbye to Europe, but with 4 weeks between races, there was plenty of time for the teams to prepare and frown worriedly at their balance sheets, and for the fans and pundits to speculate and theorise.